So this is the second part of a series on shame. Last week we spent a long time making a distinction between positive shame, useful shame, and negative shame, useless or even damaging shame. And we decided to call the positive kind correcting. So if we correct our behavior after seeing that we did something wrong, then that's a good thing. Versus shame, which was more a sense of our own inherent worthlessness. I was talking to a colleague, someone who I trained with in Japan for many years at Sogenji. Just this afternoon, we were on the phone, just talking, and I told him that I would be giving a talk on shame and asked him if he had anything to suggest I might include in this talk. And he said, shame has the nature being something which, if you hold at arm's length, it will destroy you. You really have to let it in. If you don't, if you try to avoid it in any way, it will wreck you. He said, we set off on this path thinking that we are out to find enlightenment, but really we're out to find our shame. So you have to embrace that. That's what's happening here. I'm out to find my shame. And we could say out to find my correcting or something, which is good. We can say that. But I want to put it in those terms because I want us to let in that experience, the deep experience of not wanting to face, accept, hold our shame. I was talking to someone else, someone who isn't from the US, about this also, and from Asia. And I said, I'm going to give a talk on shame. And she said, what do you mean when you say shame? What do Americans mean when they talk about shame? What are they even talking about? And I said, I don't know. I'm not sure. What do you think? Your guess is as good as mine. And she said, are they saying that they are reviewing their behavior and realize that they could have done something better? I said, I don't think so. I don't think that's even close. I think that someone who does that is a person who is not subject to this thing that's being referred to here. So she said, so maybe they're talking about how they think that they don't deserve what they have. Is that what it is? And I said, I don't know. And she said, maybe they think that they're worthless. Is that it? I said, I don't know. So it's important for us to look at this very closely. We talk about shame as if what it is already clear. We talk about the act of correcting as if that is obvious and clear. What is that? It may seem as if we already know the answer, but it is interesting that it can often be difficult to define it, difficult to identify precisely what we're talking about. So I'd suggest that this attitude of shame is basically about a conclusion that we are inherently worthless. That we are that way and that we must be that way. That's an inherent quality that can't change. We are inherently flawed, or we are inherently bad, or we're inherently meaningless. Something like that. to be forthright here, this is about attitudes, about ways of looking at things. And so I'm going to bring up some certain attitudes and certain ways of looking at things that are common in certain traditions, you could say spiritual traditions. I'm not attempting to characterize the mystical, the, well, to be quite blunt, the honest aspects of those traditions, but traditions have the duty to help people, to help everyone, and not everyone is all that interested in personal growth. So you have to help people who aren't interested in personal growth, and to do that, basically your only option is to indoctrinate and trick them. So that is often done out of compassion. You're trying to help them out, but they don't want to be helped, and so you do what you have to do. So I'm not blaming this, but it is important for us, if we're in a position to experience personal growth, then we should know that there are certain qualities of various traditions that used to be helpful but are no longer helpful. We may have had a sickness before and been taking a medicine. If we get better, we should stop taking the medicine, or else the medicine itself will make us sick. In the same way, we may have certain attitudes. Those attitudes may have helped us in the past, but there can come a point when it's time to stop having those attitudes, stop looking at things in that way, or else those ways of seeing will make us sick. So the point that this individual brought up was that she said in her country, there is a group of people who live, look like, have roughly the same culture as the mainstream, but they're Christians. Okay, so they're Asian, they look Asian, behave in Asian ways, but they're Christians. And she said that group does have this characteristic also, of this sense of inherent worthlessness. She said, so maybe that has something to do with it. Maybe Christianity has something to do with this. She doesn't know much about Christianity, but she heard something about original sin, and if we're taught that we are inherently evil, then it's more likely that we'll think that we are inherently evil. If that's the worldview that's given to us, that there's something inherently wrong with you, that you are basically original sin, then it's natural that we would have the sense that there's nothing that can be done about this, that I just am bad. I have been bad and I will be bad. This is a permanent characteristic. This is totally different from her tradition, which happens to be Buddhism, which teaches that everything changes and that your actions influence those changes. So there isn't a stable good or bad self, soul inside of you, and the decisions that we make, the actions that we take, produce the future. She said that they talk about it's just God's will, which is a disempowering attitude, but she doesn't even understand that. She said that obviously every day I experience my own will has an impact, so why would I see things as I'm inherently bad, and then all of this is up to some God's will? It doesn't make sense. I know, I lived in Tibet for a while, and I had the opportunity to visit a high school class at one point, which, as many of you know, I love to do. And one of the girls in the class, this was a group of 14, 15-year-olds, she was so happy that I came in, because she had a question that she wanted to know so much. She raised her hand and she said, why is it that the Christians come and try to stop us from being happy? I understand it's sad that they're not happy, but why should they try to take that happiness away from us? Because we're great here. Things are fine. We don't want to feel bad about ourselves and the world. So can you explain this to me? Is there some incentive for this? What's going on here? And she was completely innocent. Just imagine a 15-year-old girl from a village in Tibet, so happy to see a white person, to get an answer to a question that she'd been wondering about for a long time. So, because she has this attitude, as many of you know, Christianity has not spread very, very well in Tibet. Now, of course, this isn't about Christianity as a whole, or the realizations that Christianity offers. I'm a big fan of Christianity. I was brought up Christian in this meeting house, and of course there are mystical realizations that Christianity guides us toward. But we also have to understand that part of what determines if a religious tradition succeeds is how good is it at getting followers. And it turns out that shame is an effective way to create followers. Just turns out to be the case. Does it necessarily have to play out that way? Not by any means. We have two examples just in the people mentioned in this talk so far, and actually two more examples of people who were brought up that way and got out of it. Me and this monk who I was talking to this afternoon. People who were brought up with a certain attitude of inherent worthlessness and then managed to get out of it. I would like to say that it isn't just Christianity that has this. And in fact, the Christian version isn't nearly as powerful or pernicious as some other versions. So many people in this room, I expect, are subject to significant degrees of shame, but may not identify as Christian. However, I bet, because of the cultural, historical happenstance of Buddhism coming to this country, that many of you are liberal, politically liberal. Maybe everyone in this room is politically liberal, which I consider to be a big problem, actually. It's a failing on our part that we have been so self-centered, biased, narrow-minded in our presentation of Buddhism in the West. I would hope that Buddhism would be equally appealing to conservatives and liberals alike. And I do not consider that a failing of conservatives. I consider that a failing of our presentation. So in any case, I can say this. Liberals seem to be primarily driven by shame. As far as I can tell, if you look at the base motivations of liberals versus conservatives, it's, would you rather hate yourself or others? If you like hating yourself more than hating others, you're a liberal. If you like hating others more than yourself, then you're a conservative. Which one is worse? That's hard to say, but I can say what's better, which is neither. You don't have to choose between those two options. And I can say that as my path has proceeded, and I've become less and less motivated by shame. I identify with shame less and less. It seems to me less real. It's an occasion. It's sort of like, what do I say? Sort of like this plane going by in my life now. Does that make sense? Many of you probably didn't even notice it. What?
I noticed it.
Oh, good, see? So you can notice it. There's a plane going by, but it's not a big deal. You're not going to get up and go outside and yell at it to make it go away. It's just going by, and there we are. Maybe there are certain times when you do something significant about it. I'll be doing something highly significant this week about some planes going by. And so sometimes you have to deal with it, but basically it's not the center of your life. As that's happened, I have found it harder and harder to identify as a political liberal. I just don't understand where y'all are coming from anymore. I can see it, I just can't understand it. And I doubt you can. I don't think you understand it either. I think people just fall into this shame spiral and it all flows from there. It isn't a matter of understanding or clarity. It just self-replicates. So this is another system, another mindset, another way of looking at things, a way of motivating people, a way of gathering followers that seems to be shame-based. And it's frightening to consider, well, wait a second, if we dismantle this motivating mechanism, well, what would happen to the world? if we stop shaming ourselves and others, what would happen? What would happen to the liberal political force? This seems scary because it might just dissolve, vanish, and then what would happen next? Oh no. So know that yes, there is a certain value to this. There's a certain value to mental slavery. But if you're capable of going beyond it, you should. However, there is another mindset, another way of looking at things that's even more pernicious and has gathered even more followers than those that we've discussed so far. And that is the teaching that you are just a bunch of molecules bumping into each other. And that is all you are. That is what you are, and that is all you are. If that's true, if the typical interpretation of that is true, then it isn't just that you are inherently bad. It's actually worse than that. It's that you are inherently meaningless. It isn't just that you can't do anything because you're just molecules bumping around and there's no free will, and so you can't do anything. It's that whatever happens remains meaningless, whatever you do. This is the typical interpretation of this doctrine. Whether it's certain people who actually make this explicit, or whether it's simply our subconscious understanding of it, or whether we actually play it out in our own experience and logically conclude that that's the case. In any case, it's extremely dangerous. It may be the case that there's never been anything more dangerous on Earth than this worldview. So, that's sort of heavy, that most of us here are subtly or explicitly enslaved by the most damaging worldview of all time. So I'll try to lighten it up a little bit, but not much, so don't get too hopeful. So as many of you know, I get obsessively interested in things. For different periods of my life, I'm obsessive about this or that. Recently, for the past year or two, I've been obsessively interested in superheroes. I find superheroes, and in particular the popular versions of superheroes, for example the superhero movies, of which there are many right now, to be fascinating. Because it's a deep insight into our collective worldview. People pay to see these things. That's fascinating. That's very, very interesting. They're very popular. It's a powerful genre for both being indoctrinated and also demonstrating how we would like to be indoctrinated. So I love them. I think it's really fun. And even though I spend more time researching them than watching them, nonetheless, I very much enjoy this phenomenon. So, of all of the villains in the superhero universe, my favorite, the one that I think is designed, written, imagined most skillfully, most powerfully, is a Batman villain. So Batman is one of the superheroes, so probably most of you have heard of Batman. Batman is an interesting superhero as well, because he doesn't have any superpowers. There's a villain, the most famous and most important villain in the Batman world, who's called the Joker. The Joker is fascinating, because unlike other villains who do bad things for, you could say, reasons, maybe even good reasons, like the villain Thanos, who's been rewritten recently from a different universe. He does things that a lot of people disagree with, but he has his reasons. Very interesting reasons, which I would love to give several hours of lectures on. But the Joker isn't bad because he's evil. He's bad because he dismantles the distinction between good and evil. To him, there isn't good or evil. Everything is just, quote, meaningless. You could say everything's just a joke. Happiness is a joke. Suffering is a joke. Everything is equally a joke. There isn't a difference. There isn't any significant difference between good and evil. There isn't any significant difference between skillful and unskillful, wholesome and unwholesome behavior. It's just a joke. It doesn't make any difference. What you do doesn't matter. You're not good. You're not evil. It doesn't matter. It isn't just that you can take the attitude that it doesn't matter and avoid dealing with difficult issues. It's that it really actually doesn't matter. It actually doesn't matter. This is the modern view. You're just molecules. Everyone's just molecules. Everything's just molecules. They're just bumping into each other in a, you could say random, or you could say predestined fashion. It doesn't matter. There's no one there. That's it. All there is cycles of resource acquisition. That's all that's happening, and it's happening in an arbitrary and meaningless way. This view is the most powerful view, as far as I can tell, in the history of the world, for compelling people to believe that you are inherently worthless. Why? Because you're inherently meaningless. If this is true, and I'm not saying it is, but if it is true, then what you do doesn't matter. What you're experiencing doesn't matter. That's worthlessness. It is surprisingly difficult to get through this. It's surprisingly difficult to break free of this, especially since we're indoctrinated from an early age to believe it. As far as I can tell, this is actually what the argument is about when people are talking about, say, evolution versus intelligent design. People typically cast that argument in ways that, to me, don't make any sense. We cast the other side as if they're just stupid. But the other side is not just stupid. The other side is saying something which we can't hear, whichever side we're on. We should learn what they're saying. And as far as I can tell, it's basically a question of this. The people who say there's evolution are basically saying everything is meaningless. And you may not want to be saying that, but if you're subject to the kind of shame that I bet you are, you probably are saying that. The other side is saying, no, things are meaningful. Things are meaningful because God made them that way. This isn't nearly as pernicious, but there are far less pernicious views than this. Because that's still saying, well, it's all God's will, and I'm original sin, and there we are. So I would suggest that it's not as bad, but it isn't as good as discarding both of these perspectives. Directly discarding both of these perspectives. How do we do this? How do we actually do this? The first point is to notice that we are creating these perspectives. We're actively creating these perspectives. It's hard to notice this, but it's worth pointing them out, and it's worth pointing them out to each other when we're in conversation. Pointing out how it is that we're subtly saying these things. And that way we can help each other. But in order to do that, we have to do something else. We have to do something prior to that. And that is, we have to approach shame as something that we are out to find. We are not going to hold it at arm's length. We're not going to push it away. We're not going to avoid it. On the contrary, we're entering this path to find it. Where is my shame? Let's do this. Let's find it. Let's dance rather than merely hold it at arm's length. Let's be informed by it. If we can't do that, if we've concluded that we can't handle the shame in its negative formation, that we can't accept it, that we have to keep it away, then that emotional state, that underlying assumption, makes these other views entirely rational. It makes perfect sense to see things in those ways if we're not going to deal with shame from the beginning. If you're not going to deal with it, well then, sure, see everything as meaningless. Then you don't have to deal with it. It doesn't make any difference if you deal with it anyway, so it doesn't matter. And furthermore, if you're not going to deal with it, then it seems to be permanent. It appears permanent because it can't change. It's just this being, we are actively maintaining its stability by holding it at arm's length. So it appears real, which means it makes sense to think, well, it is real. I am inherently evil, or I'm inherently worthless. Because of our activity in our relationship with shame, I want to be clear on that word, our activity, our participation in our relationship with shame, it is maintained. And we need to see how it is that we're holding it at arm's length, how it is that we're avoiding it, how it is that we're not fully receiving it, fully opening up to the emotional impact of that shame totally entering us, and then receiving what it offers, which is good news and improved life. It's telling us this shame can be and ought to be, and in fact is inherently conscious, a word that we talked about last week a little bit. It's a magnificent quality that we have, a magnificent quality. We don't need to avoid it. There's no reason to avoid it. A lot of the time we have the sense that we're just a bunch of people trying to survive because that's what DNA does, and trying to acquire sensual pleasures because that's human nature. Human nature, that we're saying, this is real. This is our nature. This is just who we inherently are. We're actively promulgating. We're proselytizing. We're evangelical in this way, attempting to demonstrate to people that we're inherently flawed, or worse, inherently meaningless. As we promulgate this view, we produce the conditions in which we do not receive the teachings of this, quote, shame, which is to say, the conscience within it that can correct our behavior. The very act of not facing the shame, without us typically noticing it, produces the understanding that we cannot face it, which is to say, we have a sense of a lack of self-confidence, or you could say a deep insecurity. There's something significant in my life which I can't face. I am unable, I am weak, I'm incompetent in this way. And so we inculcate a sense of inability, of incapacity, of incompetence, of impotence within us. Because we don't have that confidence, we don't open up to it. Because we don't open up to it, we affirm that we should not have that sense of self-confidence. So, how do we break this? The first thing is, if there is a sense of shame, open up to it to the maximum extent you can. Whatever that happens to be. It can be tiny, but know that even if it's just tiny, you get then that tiny amount of self-confidence from doing it and noticing that it didn't kill you. It won't kill you. So you open up to it, you notice, I can do this. And then with that confidence, you can open up to a bit more of your shame. That will give you more self-confidence. You can then open up to more. That will give you more. Until eventually you have access to your shame in an open enough way, not holding at arm's length anymore, but fully receiving it, that its activity of conscience begins to function. When that happens, we can actually change how we live. If we change how we live, then that is the overturning of this lack of self-confidence, of this self-hatred, of this deep patterned shame. When we start changing how we actually live, then a confidence emerges that we can't imagine. And then things like sensual pleasures stop seeming nearly so appealing. The Buddha said something very interesting. And he uses the word shameless. We might say shame-free. But I'm going to use the typical translation of this because of the different way that in the Buddhist text the word shame is typically translated. But shameless means that you don't have to feel ashamed. You don't have reason to feel ashamed. You're behaving in a way that should not make you ashamed. You're behaving well. He said, even the most wonderful sensual pleasures. So you can all take a moment considering what to you would be the most wonderful sensual pleasures. Just imagine maybe it's a meal, maybe it's a vacation somewhere, maybe it's some wonderful experience with a partner, who knows. You can imagine the most extraordinary sensual pleasures. He said, even the most wonderful sensual pleasures don't provide even a 16th of the happiness that one receives from living a shameless life. From living a life that one doesn't need to be ashamed of. The happiness, the pleasure, the joy that comes from living a life that we don't have to be ashamed of. This wins. When we taste that kind of pleasure, then our addiction to sense pleasures it breaks down, begins to break down. In our world, we're quite addicted to sense pleasures. That's what we're offered in the most in our economy, in our world. And as far as I can tell, the basic reason for that is that we are not being offered the happiness that comes from living a life free of shame. That life free of shame, though, requires two changes. One is that we change the way we look at things, and the other is that we change the way we live. That's what we're doing here. We're working on those things in this group. And so know that you did it. You made it. You're here. You're doing the thing that's going to resolve this. It's not undoable. It's completely doable. This is not impossible. It can seem impossible. It is not impossible. I can tell you from my experience, I've done it. I know lots of people who have done it. It's a skill. Looking at things in a productive way, living in a productive way. These are just skills that you just work on. But if we're convinced that you cannot change the way you look at things, and that what you do doesn't make any difference, or that you're inherently flawed, so however you look at things is still going to be wrong, and whatever you do is still going to be wrong, then of course we won't make those efforts. And that view is what this world that's destroying life on the planet depends on. It depends on that. Depends on people seeing things in this way and living in this way. See what I'm saying? It depends on that form of mental slavery, and therefore we act as if we're slaves. It depends on it. Because we approach things in this way, the world is maintained. I've told some of you the story. I had a friend named Tom States in college who I really looked up to, and I was a freshman, he was a senior, and he had the nicest room on campus. And I mentioned, I said, wow, you have a really nice room. And he said, of course, I got this, I don't know how he said it, but of course I have this room. I got it. I made them give it to me. And I said, you can do that? And he said, it's because people like you don't know that you can do that I can. That was a huge gift. That was an enormous teaching for me. But good news, in this case, it's the opposite of the nicest room on campus. Because there's only one nicest room on campus, and if you get it, someone else doesn't. But in this way, the more people who see things in this healthy way and live in this healthy way, the easier it is for other people to see things in that way and live in that way. So it's the opposite situation. By doing it, you actually create the resource rather than taking the resource. You invite others to have the same, to also live in the nicest room in their life. And we all have that. It's right there if we stop holding it at a distance. So I'd suggest that holding shame at a distance, not being willing to experience it fully, is the same thing as holding a shameless life at a distance and not experiencing it fully. These are the same thing. If we refuse to experience shame fully, we make it the foundation of our lives, both in terms of the way we see the world and in the way we live in the world. It's by receiving it, by carefully, deliberately, with confidence, without rush, receiving the shame that comes, that we convert it into correcting, into correction, into improvement, into self-confidence. This is just how it's done. So, right now we have the opportunity to practice that and to gain these skills. Take a moment to establish your posture. This, in many traditions, is the first step in working with what we're calling shame. Most of us, most of the time, hold a posture that is consonant with and upholds shame. If you consider how does a person look when they're ashamed, consider the physical posture of their body. They're slumped. We often say that one loses face, or their face is down. We are not upright, and we also have a sense of tension. There's simultaneously a giving up and a holding on. And this is the posture that many of us live in. It's hard to know what to do about the mental state of shame. And so we're offered a feasible step. The feasible step is transform the physical posture of shame. Don't create the physical basis for the mental attitude. I am weak, flawed, evil, worthless. On the contrary, shift your posture. And I'd ask everyone to try to do this now. I know it may be hard. I know you may feel that at this time you have perfect posture that couldn't possibly be improved. I know it may feel that way. But I've been working on my posture for 30 years now, and I'm still finding ways to improve it. Try to shift and try to keep on shifting until you die. Until you die, you have the opportunity to improve your posture. It's not something that most people finish in an evening. Discover a new way to hold a sense of majesty, of nobility, self-confidence, power, love, beauty in your posture. Every part of your body is included in this. So pay attention, shift your posture. Consider, how would a person look how would their body represent their feeling if they had just done something magnificent? Something that they can be proud of. Something that was of true benefit, that can be used as evidence against the view, I am inherently evil, flawed, worthless. And then take that posture. Take that posture now. Of course, we can take this posture to the point that it may turn into the posture of one who is feeling superior, egotistical, you might call prideful. If you take your posture to that point, I'd suggest, well, don't worry about that too much. Feel that for a little while before returning to one of self-confidence. It's okay to go back and forth over this line of too much self-confidence, too little self-confidence. It's okay to explore that. You can miss in both directions. See what it feels like to be too self-confident. See if it's true. Is that too self-confident? See what it feels like to be insufficiently self-confident. What is that like? Your body is the tool you use to explore this. Why? Because it's feasible. It's a feasible way of doing experiments. It's much harder to simply conclude, now I will feel this way, now I will think this way, now I will see this way, now I will live this way. But we can consider, now I will sit this way. It's an easy first step. And now, intentionally take a posture that cultivates and supports this sense of negative shame. Sit in a way that makes you feel worthless and flawed and inherently evil. And notice that this is an act that you can intentionally produce. Simply by changing your posture, you can bring forth these emotional feelings. And in fact, these mental conclusions, which may become intellectual convictions. Try now very carefully to distinguish, and this may be hard, between a posture that would indicate positive shame, which means you feel bad about something you did and you feel confident that you can improve in the future. And now you're working it out. What mistake did I make? How could I improve? That is a positive experience. That's a good thing. Don't take that posture. Take a posture that indicates that you cannot improve. That there is no way forward. You may find, interestingly enough, that it's much less dramatic. Which is to say, that a posture of this negative shame is one in which we hold shame at arm's length. we do not receive it. If we really go into the posture of shame, then we're receiving it fully. In that way, we will improve. So try to take the posture in which shame, your inherent worthlessness, is present but held at arm's length. This totally half-hearted posture. And then once again shift to the sense of positive shame, which is to say, sense of self-confidence. And notice that you may shift even more into the posture of shame in order to receive it fully, or you may shift into a posture of what you might call self-confidence. So you may actually slump even more, wince, and find yourself almost helplessly considering how you might improve your life. This is not what we're talking about when we say a negative sense of shame. This is useful. Or you may take the posture of one who has already improved their life in some way and feels magnificent. Now once more take your best attempt at a posture that is negative shame, and try also to breathe in the way that you would if you believe that you are inherently worthless, inherently bad, inherently meaningless. Try to breathe in a way that helps you to hold those damaging attitudes. Simply to notice, not because we want to cultivate these attitudes, but because it's very important that we acknowledge that these attitudes are created, formed, that they have causes and conditions, and some of them are physical. And now, move into the posture of fully receiving shame, beginning the positive process of correction. This might be very slumped, who knows? You'll have to find out for yourself. And notice how you breathe under those circumstances. What sort of breath accords with this total reception of our errors, based on the clear understanding that this is not inherent, this is not our nature. On the contrary, it's produced by specific causes and conditions which we can change. That mistake was caused. Those causes can be changed. And now take the posture that's in accord with having made those changes. If you have made those changes, how do you sit? And then notice how you breathe. This new sense of self-confidence, having proven that you are not inherently flawed, you are not inherently meaningless. A moment I'll ring the bell, and then attempt to continue this exercise with posture and breathing as you walk. If possible, if you feel comfortable, get up and walk, either inside or outside. And attempt as you do that to maintain this technique. Very good. And as you settle into your seated posture, continue to play with postural and breathing adjustments that accord with the stages of correcting, or the positive type of shame that indicates a self-confident belief in transformation. And with that bodily cultivation, with the establishment of physical confidence in transformation, bring your attention to your direct experience right now. Which is to say, an experience that isn't narrative, that isn't story, that isn't a belief. So it could be simply looking at the screen of darkness and brightness behind your closed eyes. It could be attending to the flow of your breath. You could be listening to the sounds outside. Simply attend to it. If you're distracted, that's fine. Just gently bring your attention back. And notice that in that experience, and directly in that experience, you can observe change. It is changing. Whether you're breathing, whether you're looking at the blank screen behind your closed eyes, whether you're listening to the sounds outside, that experience is changing. And notice that as you observe your experience changing moment by moment, your awareness of that is clear and bright. If you hear the birds outside, your awareness of that is clear and bright. Even though, you might even say because of the fact that, those sounds are changing. And if you're aware even of the darkness behind your closed eyes, your awareness of that is clear and bright. And if you're aware of your breath, noting that you're inhaling while you're inhaling, exhaling while you're exhaling. As you're directly aware of your breath coming and going, that awareness also is clear and bright. And if you're aware of being confused, unclear about what clear and bright means, then our awareness of that is clear and bright. We're directly aware, vividly aware of that confusion. There's a clarity, a vividness, a brightness to our experience before we tell stories about it. Notice that as you directly encounter this moment as it changes, this changing moment, this moment of awareness is already clear and bright. Whatever it is we're aware of, that awareness is clear and bright. And when we experience this, we find a meaning prior to stories, attitudes, narratives, doctrines. And if we hear someone say something like that, if you have direct experience prior to stories and doctrines, then you find a meaning prior to stories and doctrines. If we hear that and try to turn it into a doctrine, then even our awareness of that is already clear and bright. Because of that, we can fully receive this moment with a bright, clear awareness, even if this moment is a moment of shame. And we realize that conscience, if we resist it and don't experience it completely, is shame. And shame, if we don't resist it and experience it completely, is conscience. Shame is damaging and conscience saves the world. Gives us joy, sustains us, fulfills us, and is meaningful. a time for conversation, discussion, questions, answers, sharing. So, the time is yours. Yes?
Both last week and this week you gave a number of examples how people in Eastern cultures, I guess Buddhist or not, but just Eastern culture as a whole, simply doesn't understand this concept of shame or the word we use for shame. And then you said today, the Buddha said that the most sensual pleasures you have are not 1/16th as wonderful as a life lived free of shame. So in 2500, I mean clearly the Buddha must have known what shame is if we're talking the same language for interpreting it. And is that to say that in 2,500 years, Buddhism has wiped out the whole concept of shame in the East? Or it just seems like...
It's a good question. I'm not sure. That is certainly one interpretation of this story, that people perhaps did experience the thing that we're referring to and then cultures were formed that overcame that. That's one interpretation, of course, and it's one that we should consider. And that may be part of it, of course. But again, it may just be that we have to ask, what do we mean when we say shame?
Right.
And in general, the Buddha would recommend the experience of feeling bad about it when you do bad things. This is actually often referred to as the first step on the path, that you should feel bad if you do bad things. A lot of the time we think I'm going to practice. This, I think, is what my brother in the Dharma was referring to when he said we think we're going to find enlightenment, but in fact we find our shame. That you find your own awareness of how it is that you're not living an ethical life. But that's good. That's good news that you found that. It just isn't the end. If you experience that thing in a healthy way, then it will motivate you to make changes, both in the way you understand the world, the way you perceive the world, and in the way you engage it, and the way you live in it. Those changes having been made give us the pleasure that is referred to in this sentence, in this teaching. That even the greatest of sensual pleasures don't provide 1/16th the joy, the pleasure, the fulfillment of living a life without that shame. But in order to get past that, you need to experience it. So you're doing something improper, you then have the experience of being ashamed of that, you then make the changes, and then you're not doing that improper thing anymore. That part is extremely joyful. So I think we could even look at it in both ways at the same time. These two explanations may not be contradictory. Yes? That by understanding shame well enough to use it skillfully, we can receive it fully and therefore overcome it. That when working with shame is understood as a skill, then we can work with it skillfully enough that we no longer are doing the things that we were ashamed of. Because of that, we feel very happy. When we've done that enough times, then when shame arises, yes, we automatically start to feel excited. Because we're looking forward to that. Yes? You start to your body itself starts to get excited. Oh good, I found something I'm not doing well enough. I bet I can do it better. Oh boy. It may not be long before I've made this transformation and I get to experience a happiness that I've never experienced before. This is very exciting. And that sort of excitement, it is not what you call sensual pleasure. It's a different kind of pleasure that living according to our conscience, to ethics, to in fact our nature, that provides. But it can be similar, but there's similarities with what you might think of as sensual pleasure. Yes? So, not to make it too light, but there is still snow in Vermont. Yes? Some of the mountains still have some snow. I know this because today I went skiing. And I'm one of these people who love skiing, and I know what it feels like to be looking down the slope. Yes? Looking down it. There's this sense in my body of, oh yes. I just want, just something in me wants to do that.
Like
It's, what?
Like what?
Yeah, it's right there, and I just know, oh yeah, here it is. Here it is. This is it. It's going to be great on the way down, you know? And especially, you know, if you have first tracks, it's even fun to look back and you see your, you know? So you don't get that really at this time of year, but there's this sense of, this is just fantastic. Here it is. And there's that same sense when you realize, the experience that you feel when you say to yourself, oops, oh, I shouldn't have said that. It's the same sense of, but I don't need to ever say that again. And if I change the way I look at things and the way I live, I won't. And then I get to be happy in a way I never could be if I didn't change this pattern. It's coming. And it's that same, there's this challenging situation, but the challenge itself is fun. And you start to want it. And that, I have the sense, is actually the difference. That for us, you look at that slope and you're just afraid. That's the norm. You have the sense of shame. You feel like, oh no, this confirms. I did something badly. It confirms that I'm flawed, bad, worthless, meaningless. It confirms it. It is true. And plus they do these bad things. So everyone's this way. It's human nature. And you start to have this attitude. And because of that, we are terrified of each other. At the end of that conversation with this woman from Asia, I mentioned, she said that the most interesting thing that she found when she came here was how scared Americans are of everything.
Oh yeah.
It's not true everywhere. This is an optional cultural phenomenon. And I've noticed for me, as I do this practice, I found myself becoming nicer, more honest, more loving. And people get more afraid of me as that has happened.
Americans do.
What?
Americans do.
Yeah, exactly. It's, as you say, optional. But a lot of people seem really afraid of that. And I think mainly because it's a threat to our worldview. It feels scary to have to consider that the way we live and see things may not be inherently true. We may have fabricated it. So you see someone being nice, and isn't it true? If someone's being nice, we immediately wonder, why? What are you after? What are you trying to get from me? It's this transactional relationship that is based on a lot of assumptions. Yes? So we find ourselves, not you, but we find ourselves in a kind of a vat, a soup of this attitude, and we are working to change it, to purify it, by receiving a sense of inadequacy, yes, of shame. I don't want to take too long on this, but just tell another point about myself. I think that this is I think I can finally tell this story. So we had someone come and he did a survey of the people in the Monastic Academy a few years ago. And he asked, what the questions were, please rate how true this statement is in your experience. Okay? So, and then there are a number of points. Okay? How true is this for you? And there are a number of questions, but some of them were, I am worthless. I am mistaken. I am inadequate. Right? Then you had to rank it scale of 1 to 10. And for me, I got 9s and 10s for all of it. Yes? And he looked at it, he looked at me. He was one of my students, actually. He knows my subjective experience. And he just said, you know, you might not want to tell anyone about this. because they're not going to get it. They're not going to understand what this is. Most of us are trying to drop that down as far as we can, right? But I'm not. I'm open to all of those experiences completely. Yes? Not completely. I got a long way to go to completely, but pretty completely, right? I do my best. 9s, right? And I'm at a 9, but maybe it's an exponential scale, so it's a long way. But it matters that we reinterpret shame, sense of inadequacy, as, well, this is really how I see it. I say, if I feel inadequate, I don't know if this is going to make any sense to you, but this is how it is for me. If I feel inadequate, then I must not be like that inherently. I don't know if that makes any sense. It makes perfect sense to me. If I really were inadequate, I wouldn't feel that what I've done is inadequate.
Right.
It's that I'm not, so I should feel as inadequate as possible. Does that make any sense? Okay. Oof. So, this is why he said, maybe don't tell him that. But now I can't. This is a big opportunity.
You have to be deaf with the English language to try and get those points across.
Let's try to wrestle with this. So I have the sense that that the point of the teaching from the Buddha was, we're going to reframe, we're going to recast the experience of being ashamed as an opportunity. So you have to make full advantage of that opportunity by feeling this fully, and then you will make the changes and you'll live in a new way, see in a new way, and that's when this great joy will come. But it isn't only then. It's an adventure along the way. And you get better and better at that adventure.
And if I had heard the story of the Buddha in a vacuum, along with your further clarification, it'd be fine. But when you then, last week, said, well, the Dalai Lama had to consult his interpreter and said, what is this concept shame? No, I cannot help you.
Precisely, because...
so, I mean, but it's almost like, you know, those who study Buddhism or even who live in a non-Western culture are free from it when the Buddha apparently, if we're talking the same term, clearly understood it.
Well, right, but I think the point is that, I think maybe your point is good, I don't know. But the point is possible that at the Buddha's time, this is just an idea, I like your suggestion, that maybe at the Buddha's time it wasn't so clear which way you're going to go with shame. Is it evidence that you can't change, or is it an opportunity to change? In that case, if he and the culture did a good enough job at showing that shame is an opportunity to change, then you wouldn't see it as a problem. And I have the sense that the actual confusion, I wasn't there, but I have the sense that the actual confusion was, why is that a problem? What are you talking about? I don't see why this is an issue. It's like any other number of things, you know. It's like if you came to me and said, there's a big hill right here and I'm wearing skis, this is frightening. I'd say, well, right, you could see it that way, or I could give you some skills and it would be fun. But eventually, if everyone had that skill, right, then eventually you wouldn't understand what someone even might mean when they were afraid of this wonderful opportunity.
Right.
You might forget. Your culture might forget. Because you're either doing good things or you have the opportunity to improve. Here goes. what a great life, you know? Then you're open to things, you're not afraid of everything in the way that we often are. Not to make, I don't want to take up too long on this point or to talk about sports too much, but one of my favorite quotes of all athletes is by Billie Jean King, who was a famous tennis player, who many of you may have heard of. And she was talking about tennis. She's teaching tennis. They were videoing this. And she said something just perfect. It was brilliant for tennis anyway. But we can bring it out to a larger field. She said, the biggest problem that most people have when playing tennis is that they're afraid to hit the ball. And if you're afraid to hit the ball in tennis, you have a problem. So I would say that the main problem for most of us is that we're afraid to have experiences. And if you exist and you're afraid to have experiences, you have a problem. So we need to find a way to shift it so that something like shame that we're typically afraid of becomes an exciting opportunity. And as I've said, I don't know, a dozen times now, that's a skill which we can develop. And I have the sense that eventually, if your theory is true, it became automatically taught in the culture. And so you forget even that it's a skill in the same way that we have forgotten that it's a skill. If you can't do it, it's not a skill. Does that make sense? You couldn't develop that as a skill. And if everyone just does it, it's hard also to see it as a skill.
There's a vast Western influence now infiltrating Asia,
Right.
you know, sends it all backwards.
Right, although next week I'll talk a little bit about that, because I would say it's somewhat broader than, quote, Western influence. And next week I'll talk more about that side, about the large-scale cultural source of this phenomenon.
How can you tell if you're ashamed of things that are actually harming the world, or if you're ashamed of things and then you make changes that harm the world more?
Well, yes, this is very hard, of course. This is the question, isn't it? You're asking, how do you know? This is a very big question. One might say that this is the final question. There's a famous story about Damodaro Bhikkhu, I think that's Ajahn Lee's original name, when training with Ajahn Mun, one of his main teachers, who asked him the following question once his practice was very deep. These are two Buddhist monks. Once the disciple, Damodaro Bhikkhu's practice was quite deep, his teacher, Ajahn Mun, asked him, ignorance is a kind of knowing. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure.
So ignorance is a kind of knowing. So if you think that this is, say, a flower, right? If you're confused about which of these is a flower, you think this is a flower, that's a kind of knowing. You know that this is a flower, okay? Wisdom is a kind of knowing. So he said, ignorance is a kind of knowing. Wisdom is a kind of knowing, okay? How do you know the difference? That is a huge question. It's a question that requires us to pass beyond knowing. And so you're asking a fundamental question, a huge question. And it's of the utmost importance, especially for someone like you who's decided to be a professional wisdom seeker, to directly realize the answer to your question. Okay? That's your job now. That's the job you're taking on. You're taking on the job of finding the answer to that question. Okay?
What's the difference between...
What was your question? Do you remember?
How do you know if you're ashamed of things that are harming the world?
And, furthermore, how do you know if the changes you make
Are harming the world more or helping the world?
Exactly. So it's your job to find the answer to that question. That's your job.
Would you repeat it, the question?
Sure. Do you want to or should I?
You should, I can't hear her.
Oh, very good. So the question was, First of all, how do you know if what you're doing is, if what you're ashamed of is actually harming the world? Okay? And second, let's say you make a change, let's say that you change that. How do you know if the changes you make are causing even more harm or are in fact benefiting the world? It's an excellent question, and as I say, it's your job, in fact all of our job, to find that. But you have explicitly claimed now that it's your job.
By asking the question.
Yes, by asking the question. Well said. That's exactly right. But by choosing to professionally ask that question, because Ashley has joined the program now, so she's going to be living at the Monastic Academy, and so it's her job to actually answer this question so that someone else could ask her and she would be able to respond with a sense of authority. So that's your job. And in fact, as I say, it's everyone's job. And a lot of us make claims about the answer, having not realized it. That makes big problems in the world, but how would you know that? So you should explore that. How can you confirm or deny my claim? So given that it's difficult to know, I'll give you something to work with until you know. Okay? Actions that you take and views that you hold that are based on greed, hate, or delusion, insanity, will damage the world. You should be concerned about that. And you should work to take views, to see things in ways, and to take actions, to do certain things that are not based on greed, hatred, and delusion, insanity. Believe it or not, that does give you a starting point. Because to a certain extent, you do know. Yes? To a certain extent, to some extent, you do know whether greed, hatred, delusion is present in your heart as you perceive and behave, as you see and do. To a certain extent, you're clear on that. Okay? So you should reflect. You should reflect. These actions that I'm taking, yes? Are they based on those things or not? If it turns out that that's too hard, that that's too confusing, well then you can make it even simpler than that. I'd recommend that you look at it in that way. But if that seems too abstract, what is he talking about? Greed, hatred, delusion, I don't know what that even means, this isn't a feasible step, then we can make it into a feasible step. And that is that we just back it up one more step, and you simply reflect what I just did, said, or thought. Okay? What I just did, said, or thought, was that of benefit to me, to others, or both? Was that harmful to me, others, or both? And you simply, repeatedly, you could even say relentlessly, reflect in that way. Okay? So you have two ways of doing it. But you'll note that both of them actually are based on a certain, for us, you could say assumption. But perhaps for awakened people, it's not an assumption, it's directly confirmed. And that is that you in your nature do know. You see? See the point? So you do know. All I'm telling you to do is reflect, is make use of the knowledge you have. So actually you know. Yes? You see what I'm saying? So this is a completely different attitude, you see, from needing to say be saved by someone else. You don't need to find someone who has a different nature from you in order to find the answer to this question. You see? If you needed to be saved by someone else because you can't find the answer to this question, so you need someone else to tell you, then obviously you shouldn't reflect in this way. You see? See what I'm saying? If you yourself can know, then the answer to the question is reflect, try to know, explore. You yourself, with your own wisdom, your own nature, you can discover the answer to this. You see? See what I'm saying? No?
I kind of do, and just wondering like how to figure out if one way is harmful for someone else and good for you, or...
Yeah, let's set that aside for a moment, because that's a good question, but I want to be sure that you hear what I'm saying. Because that's a great question, but I'm telling you, you'll just figure that out with time. If you reflect, you'll work it out. Okay, it's not unattainable. Millions of people have answered this question. That's not that many. But people have done it. Okay? If you try to do it, you'll do it. Does that make sense? You know Peace Pilgrim, right? You've heard of her, right? Well, she's a very famous spiritual teacher for whom I have a great deal of respect. And she said, she was talking about God. Yes, she talked about the spiritual path leading to God. That's her way of talking about it. And she said, not everyone finds God. But everyone who tries to find God finds God. If you don't find God, it's because you didn't try. That's a very strict statement. Yes? That if you find God, she talked about finding God, that means that you have complete inner peace. Complete inner peace forever. That's the indicator that you've found God. And everyone can do it. If you haven't, it's because you haven't tried. It's a very strict teaching. She seemed like such a nice lady. Seems so sweet. But this is, you know, there's a knife hidden in the pillow. So what does this assume? It assumes that you can find God. That's the pillow hidden in the knife. It's not even a pillow. It's better than a pillow. It's fantastic. Yes? So the way that we're talking about this now is that you, if you reflect and reflect, you will answer this question. But what does that say about your nature? What does that say about you?
Are you trying to find God?
That you're trying to find God, yes. And if you can, that says something very important about your nature. Yes? If you can do it, that is already how you are. You see? This is so hard to see. Well, the important thing is you're being honest about whether you're seeing it, and that is very impressive, and there's more evidence for this point. If you needed to be given this answer from the outside by someone else who has a different nature than you, okay? If you needed to go to someone who is fundamentally different from you, okay, and get the answer from them, then that would, if you had to do it that way to get it, then that would mean that you yourself couldn't find it. Which is that the answer isn't, quote, within you. Yes, the answer is outside of you, somewhere else, and it has to be provided to you. But it's not of your own nature. It's different from you, but you can acquire it. Okay? That is not what I'm saying. That's the opposite of what I'm saying. Does that clarify?
Yeah.